transportation, employment practices, recruiting policies and programs, army camp arrangements, policing, etc. In other words, we're not going to talk about it, we're not going to debate it, we are simply going to change the living arrangements under which most people live in this country. These two issues, the behavior of Negroes from the South and ethnics from the North as it impacted the war effort, were really two sides of the same coin, what Lenin and Stalin would have called America's nationalities problem. Since the Carnegie Corporation had proposed Myrdal's study in 1937, the nationalities issue had been on the establishment's mind for some time before America's entry into the war. But the issue was given new urgency by America's entry. Suddenly, the country, which had lately suffered huge unemployment, was now faced with a labor shortage. Total mobilization required unprecedented numbers of men to staff the armed forces, but more importantly, it required even more men to staff the factories that would build the armaments that those men needed to defeat fascism. America had traditionally solved its labor problems by unlimited immigration, but that source of labor ended in 1924 when the nativists put immigration quotas in place. Now that the war was on, that group of people wasn't available anyway. That meant that there were only two sources of untapped labor in the United States: women and Negroes from the South. The people in Chicago, quote, whose national origin made them suspect, close quote, continued living in their ethnic neighborhoods after the war ended, but with fascism defeated, the same group of people who were concerned about their loyalty before could now devote their efforts to engineering them full-time now. As Worth had indicated in his letter to Clyde Hart, and as he had indicated in various passages in The American Dilemma, social engineering would be focused on race and housing. Integration was defined by Louis Worth and ratified by the Supreme Court in the Berman and Brown decisions, and that meant first and foremost solving America's nationalities problem, and that meant bringing ethnic neighborhoods under control. Once the war was over and the danger of German National Socialism and Italian fascism receded, the same groups who were living in the same impenetrable ethnic neighborhoods in Chicago began to be identified more and more by their religion and less by their country of origin. Even as early as 1941, Worth, as I've already mentioned, was concerned about a corresponding shift in religious affiliation of the American population, which created a nation now a little over one-third Roman Catholic. In the parlance of psychological warfare, ethnic would increasingly come to mean Catholic, especially in the period following the war. And the ethnically balkanized cities of the North, it was a group of people who represented the greatest obstacle to Worth's concept of integration. This group, much more so than the challenge posed by de jure segregation in the politically and economically insignificant South. 1947, an ex-minister, ex-socialist, and social adventurer known as, by the name of Paul Blanchard, went to the library to do research on Catholic medical practices and was appalled at what he wrote, and so wrote an article in The Nation expressing that, which found immediate and a huge response. And so he decided to write a book, and 2 years later his book, American Freedom and Catholic Power, appeared. This book was saluted by the entire WASP establishment in America. People like William O. Douglas, John Dewey, McGeorge Bundy, and the American Puritan scholar Perry Miller all endorsed the book. Blanchard, in his book, mentions, number one, Catholic neighborhoods as the source of Catholic political power. Number two, he mentions Catholic nuns as the basis for the Catholic school system, without which the Catholic school system would collapse because the Catholics could not afford to pay their teachers. He also mentioned feminism as a way of liberating Catholic nuns. And he also mentioned Catholic fertility, in other words, Catholic sexual practices. He mentions in the book Bertrand Russell's greatest fear was that America was going to become a Catholic country and that they were going to do it by the numbers, which is to say by demographic increase. All of the projects which Myrdal talks about are ratified in Paul Blanchard's books. It's just now that we are no longer talking about Germans and Italians, we're talking about this whole group of Catholic ethnics that pose a problem, the problem of Americanization, the problem of subverting the America as these people understand it. If you read The Nation at the time, where Paul Blanchard first published his articles, there are letters to the editor about the Hollywood production code, how this is an un-American thing because the Catholics have veto power over the films that get produced, and also about the fact that Catholics are preventing the sale of contraceptives in places like Connecticut and Massachusetts. There was a referendum to legalize contraception in Massachusetts that was defeated by Catholic participation, Catholic involvement in the referendum. So the solution to all of these problems would be housing. Changing the housing patterns, changing the way Americans lived as a way of breaking up the political power of the Catholics. The general structure of this complex problem is clear-cut, according to Myrdal, or whoever wrote the book, and clear-cut and ready for social engineering. The strategic time for this planning work is now. This is 1943. After the war, a great increase in private and public funding is likely since housing construction has been more abundant for several years and popular needs seemed about to cause a building boom when the war started and diverted the construction industry's efforts into the field of defense housing. Also, the war will leave in its wake a tremendous need for public works and private investment to prevent a new and more devastating world depression. To be maximally useful, this housing boom should be planned in advance. That's 1943. The housing boom, we are living, or I am speaking now, in what was an experimental community of the New Deal, a type of housing. It reminded me, when I drove in here, of a lot of the early low-income housing in Philadelphia, the low-rise, low-income housing that were built during the 1930s to alleviate the fact that nothing got built or repaired beginning in 1929, and there was a huge housing shortage. This is, as you probably figured out, it's not the direction that the government took in terms of housing. The direction that the government took was, in a word, Levittown. The Levitt brothers had been in the housing construction business. The sons of Mr. Levitt had become Seabees in the Pacific during World War II, and while they were there, they learned the techniques of the mass production of the house. Similar to what Henry Ford did the automobile, this was the mass production of the house, which meant, let's say, laying 200 concrete pads in one day. No basement in these houses. How do you do that? What are the logistics? What do you need to do that? And that was eventually the beginning of Levittown, and Levittown became the model for similar suburban developments all across the country. Levittown at the time was conceived of as the place where the returning GI would live. William H. White wrote his book, The Organization Man, about the new worker after World War II, the organization man, the man who worked for corporations that were national corporations and became a sort of interchangeable part in a national chain of operations. A large part of his book is about Park Forest, which is the suburb just south of Chicago, which was the Chicago version of Levittown. Devoted a lot of time to writing about this. And in the course of it, pretty much explained the purpose of this in ethnic terms. That one of the people that he interviewed in Park Forest said, "You won't find any Polish Renaissance furniture in Park Forest." In other words, being Polish is what you were when you were in Chicago, but when you moved to Park Forest, you became a part of the middle class, part of the organization men, and you became a white guy. You became the generic American. You lost your ethnic identity. That was the carrot, if you want to talk about it. The stick in this regard was black migration. No, it would not have worked, I don't believe, if they simply tried to lure people to the suburbs, tried to lure these Catholic ethnics to the suburbs with low mortgage rates and $100 down payments of the type that Levitt was proposing. It would not have worked. The real engine for the migration, the dispersal of Catholic ethnics to the suburbs was black migration. In other words, the huge numbers of black sharecroppers that were coming from Mississippi to Chicago or from North Carolina to Philadelphia would be brought into the older neighborhoods, which were the Catholic ethnic neighborhoods, and they exerted pressure on the people living there. That was the stick. Levittown was the carrot. Between the two of them, over a period of, what should I say, 20, 30 years, depending, the cities were simply emptied out and, to a large extent, destroyed. It varies depending on the city. Detroit is probably the worst in this regard. If you go to Detroit, you'll see large stretches of simply empty space where there used to be houses, burned out houses. If you go to St. Hyacinth's Parish, which we visited, which is along basically the Shane Avenue, the Polish corridor in Detroit, what you'll see is the black migration advancing up the corridor and the Poles retreating step by step back away, and the houses being burnt down. It actually became a custom in Detroit to burn houses down. It's called Devil's Night, which was right before Halloween. Some people speculate it was the people burning their own houses down because they had lost all their value. But there are lots of houses. I mean, Detroit is probably the most destroyed city of those I talked about. Philadelphia probably comes in second. Chicago is probably the least destroyed city of all those because Mayor Daley at the time simply took control of racial migration. He took control of it by creating high-rise projects right next to the Dan Ryan Expressway. The Dan Ryan Expressway was a barrier that would keep the newly arrived black people on one side of the road so that Bridgeport, which is where he lived, would remain basically a white ethnic neighborhood. No city was unaffected by this. People would ask me, why didn't you do Cincinnati? Why didn't you do Buffalo, and so on and so forth? Well, because this is already 700 pages long, and I'd end up, and someone else can write that story. But basically, it happened across the board because it was orchestrated from Washington. It was centrally organized. Okay. Now, what you notice when you start reading the documents is that during World War II, the documents are OWI, OSS documents. After World War II, we still have spies in the neighborhood, except that they're not working for these organizations. The spies are now the American Friends Service Committee and the ACLU. The ACLU and the American Friends Service Committee would hire people who spoke Polish or Serbian and send them into bars on the south side of Chicago to find out what the steel workers were talking about. So there was, I don't know, does this qualify as a black operation? I mean, spying, paying people to spy